So we're going to continue this concept of stratification, and we're going to kind of look at how America is stratified today. First, the income gap between the high income and the low income individuals has increased dramatically over the last 30 years. So really, what we're saying is that since the advent of globalization, the difference between those with the most and those with the least has increased dramatically. This should raise questions for you if you've been following discussions recently about the most recent tax bill that's being passed through Congress right now. And ultimately how it gives a little to the middle class, but it gives a lot to the wealthy class. And this is a result of stratification. Those with the most are going to do whatever they have to keep as much as they can. And they can influence the system in a greater way than an individual person from the middle class. Poverty is another problem in the United States. Poverty has an official governmental definition, but there are also less official categories, such as the working poor and the non-working poor. This brings us to this major change in the workforce that has blurred the lines between the middle and the working classes, and is the rise of the low-wage service sector, composed of ostensibly white-collar jobs that earn working-class wages. These unofficial categories don't represent stable, homogeneous groups because people at this end of the socioeconomic spectrum tend to shift in and out of poverty over the course of their lives. The important thing to think about here, folks, is the creation of the low-wage service sector and who is occupying that low-wage service sector. The working class wages are being paid to white-collar workers who are doing the same types of services that they were being paid for in a much higher wage bracket than they are now. Capitalism is not working for the most of us. It's only working for some of us. We also have to think about global inequality. This allows us to take a more broad view of history. And when we do, it's clear that global inequality has increased dramatically over the past 500 years. Most likely because of the colonial period. However, by some measures, there's been a noticeable decrease in income inequality in the past 20 or 30 years. One key to these conclusions is whether you look at inequality within different countries or between countries. Many scholars have examined the question of why Europe developed first and why many former colonies have struggled to improve social and economic conditions for their populations. Theories range from geographic differences to the importance of social institutions to the types of relationships different colonial powers had with their colonies. I believe it's a mix of all of these. I think that there's a vested interest in keeping colonies disempowered and dependent on the colonial powers that can no longer officially possess colonies. This is a much deeper topic that as you study more in sociology, you'll dive more into what history has how history has played out in a way that allowed for European colonial powers to keep their control over the colonies without owning them anymore. And it's partly responsible for why you're seeing this dramatic increase in inequality, both within the United States and within the world. As always, I encourage you to check out the interviews that are provided in some of these lectures. This is by Jeffrey Sachs, talking about how educating women is key to Africa going through a demographic transition. We know that the number one indicator for controlling population in sub-Saharan Africa is education. If we educate African women, they will take that education, they will become entrepreneurs, and they will stabilize their incomes, and they will have less children as a result. We also have to talk about social mobility, or the movement between different positions within a system of social stratification in any given society. That can either be horizontal or vertical. Horizontal social mobility, which is fairly common, refers to the changing of jobs within a class. A therapist who shifts careers to teach college experiences horizontal mobility. Vertical social mobility is movement up and down the social ladder, and thus is often called upward or downward mobility. If this same therapist marries a president of a large corporation, he or she might experience upward mobility. On the other hand, if the therapist or his or her spouse gets laid off, the therapist might experience downward mobility. People are far more likely to experience horizontal than vertical social mobility. However, most Americans strive for upward social mobility. Whether they attain it or not is to be seen on a case-by-case examples. Some other important things about social mobility. Structural mobility is mobility that is inevitable from changes in the economy, such as the expansion of high-tech jobs in the past 20 years. And exchange mobility occurs when people essentially trade positions. The number of overall jobs stays the same, with some people moving up into better jobs and others moving down into worse ones. Something else that is important to think about, something that it was also talked extensively about in reference to this new tax bill, is the estate tax in the United States, which is related to the issue of stratification because it goes to the heart of questions about how to promote business growth, how wealth should be distributed, how to encourage meritocracy, and how to build a more equitable society. If you allow groups of people to keep everything that they gain over the course of their lives, no matter how much they gain, what you allow to happen is for significant amounts of money and capital to be trapped in small groups in society. And it ultimately promotes inequality and stratification within a society when you do that. That's why you have an estate tax. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, we just repealed the estate tax on anything over $11 million, I think, something like that. The little fun facts that you have to take in consideration when you take a course like sociology, the introduction to sociology. Good Lord, folks, I'm glad you're along for the ride. We are learning some stuff here. And then, of course, a way that we have used to address social inequality in the past is class-based affirmative action. One way of thinking about this is race-based affirmative action, and has resulted in a much more diverse group of college graduates, workers, and the such. But one criticism of these policies is they often end up helping those racial minorities who need it the least, those who are already privileged by class. Class now matters more than race in predicting educational opportunity and success. As race-based affirmative action loses social and legal support, many have offered class-based affirmative action as a solution. It is of my opinion, and that's just my opinion, that class matters more. Class is the prime mover. Race, ethnicity, all of those cultural trappings are merely ways to convince us that we're different. Our primary differences aren't in reference to skin color or ethnicity. They're in reference to how much you have and how much you do not have. And those that have a lot, and there's not very many of them, have way more power and influence than those that have little. And there are the majority of them.